Guys, welcome back to the podcast today. Very special guest. I have Dave Naylor joining me, TSN Football Insider. I'm very excited about this. Very excited to talk CFL. We've talked UFC on the podcast. We've talked soccer on the podcast. And having Dave now on the podcast is very exciting. Dave's going to bring a lot of knowledge, and I'm very, very appreciative of him taking the time. Dave's sports journalist, reporter for TSN, like I mentioned. Also worked for CBC Radio and the Globe and Mail. Dave was inducted in the Canadian Football Hall of Fame's media wing. Lots of credentials, graduated from Carleton University in journalism. Dave, thank you so much for taking time to join me.
My pleasure. Happy to do it.
Looking forward to talking CFL. A lot of people that I know, they love talking about the CFL, but they don't really know the ins and outs, and I follow it very, very closely. And first of all, I just want to ask you, really, how long have you been following the CFL, and how long have you really been reporting on the CFL and been working with TSN as an insider?
As a kid, I grew up a CFL fan, and it's funny, I was 16 years old when the Toronto Argonauts won the Grey Cup in 1983. And, at that time, I was kind of the last generation of people, at least in Southern Ontario, where, the Argos had a real presence among, young sports fans. It wasn't that long after that really started to change in this part of the country. And of course, in other parts of the country, it still remains so. But I was always a football fan. I did my honors in journalism on a semi-pro football team, so I was always had an interest in that. And when I came into the business in 29 years ago, almost 29 years ago exactly, the opportunities that were present for me were around Canadian football. I often joke, I grew up professionally, wanting to cover Major League Baseball. And then when I became an adult and realized, wait a minute, they play 162 games every day, and spring training starts in February, and this thing ends like in early November, late October. Honestly, part of it is football is just more friendly on your life, as a sport to cover, because they only play once a week, because the playoff game series aren't 4 out of 7. There's just way less travel, and I have always had, as I say, as a fan, a great love of Canadian football and people in the sport. And that has certainly, developed and enhanced in the years that I've been covering it. I'm still a big NFL fan. I was telling an agent the other day, I said, I've been covering, Canadian kids trying to reach the NFL since 1992. So I've seen a lot of them come and go. I like to think of football kind of more as a big community than even so much, dividing it between CFL and NFL.
I personally feel that the CFL is a hidden gem. Would you describe it as a niche market for a lot of people and something that a lot of people aren't exposed to, but if they were exposed to, they'd really fall in love with?
It depends where you are, right? Like I lived 2 years in Regina, so it's not a niche market there. That's the kind of place where, you go for breakfast, the waitress will know the depth chart better than she knows the menu. It penetrates deeply there. And certainly in other parts of Western Canada as well. I think when you get into, Southern Ontario, and it's funny how the difference though, between Hamilton and Toronto, and the two stadiums sit, I don't know, if there was no traffic, it's probably about a 45-minute drive from BMO Field to Tim Hortons Field, and yet it's night and day. So look, I think the reason the CFL has survived all these years is, two things. It's got a bit of a place kind of in the national identity for a lot of people, not everybody. But it's also a great game. I'm somebody who loves the NFL, but to me, the superior game is Canadian football. And when you watch leagues, like the XFL, where you see professional football with 4 downs on a 100-yard field without the best athletes in the world, it definitely lacks something for me. So no, I think we have a better game. I think we have a great league. I think there's so many great stories to tell in Canadian football, and I find the closer you get up to the sport and the people in it, the more appealing it becomes. I think the CFL is in many ways what other major professional sports were like, in the 1950s and 60s, where everybody wasn't making zillions and it wasn't as big a business as it's become. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. We have more in this league, more of the kind of values that sports leagues had in those days. And that's one of the characteristics of the league that I find very appealing.
I saw some CFL players tweeting out and asking Canadians why they may not be as interested in the CFL. Right. Do you have any insight to that and any thoughts regarding that? I know you just mentioned about, in Regina and certain parts of Canada, there's definitely no lacking that. Of course, some people are deeply, deeply in love with it. I have a coworker that he's a diehard season ticket holder for the Hamilton Tiger Cats. But of course, some people are just saying that the NFL is the better game, the better talent. But I'm in the same boat as you, where I honestly would rather watch a conference final, or a lot of the times I think the Grey Cups have been plenty more interesting and exciting than Super Bowls. And I think that I would get a lot of flack for saying that, Dave, but I certainly have really enjoyed it and the excitement of the game. And I think it's fair to say the CFL is a different type of game. What would you say to those Canadians that aren't really in love with the CFL and they just talk about the NFL being superior?
Well, I understand why people are often products of where they grow up, right? And I'll give you an example, okay? I am not a soccer fan. I honestly, if I could watch a CFL preseason game or the World Cup of Soccer final, I'd watch the CFL preseason game, even the second half of a CFL preseason game when it's only guys who are probably going to get cut. Soccer's not my thing, And why is it not my thing? Because I didn't really grow up with it, right? Soccer wasn't a big thing in the 1970s and early 1980s in Canada. My fixation got on leagues where there's lots of offense, and they don't have rules that restrict offensive play as much as they do in soccer. Now, that said, my grandfather was born in London. If he'd never come and I'd been born there and raised there, I'm sure I'd be a soccer nut, right? So it's a long way of saying that I think a lot of times we don't necessarily choose the sports we like. We are products of the environment that we grew up in, and we either become sort of part of the culture, or maybe, if you're a hardcore CFL fan and you're 17 years old in Toronto, it becomes a bit of a counterculture thing for you. But I think what's really changed, from when I grew up to now is just the presence of the National Football League, on television, the NFL Network, the web, that you can live in. You can be an NFL fan living anywhere. Most people, in fact, a ton of people, probably most people I know who are massive National Football League fans have never been to a game, right? You don't need to go to a game. It's a TV league. So obviously, when you have a league that attracts the best players in the world and has the amount of money behind it that the NFL does to spend every dime on their broadcast to make the product look as enhanced as possible, that's going to stand out to people. And it's no different in some ways than looking and saying, hey, the leagues that attract the best players in the world have the biggest fan bases. But I guess the difference would be, in most sports, the leagues that have the second best players in the world are pretty good. Like in soccer, there's a zillion of them, right? And if we looked at, what are the second tier leagues, there's a lot of good players in those leagues. If you look at European hockey, if you look at baseball in Japan or Taiwan, it's not as if the best league has the monopoly on all the best players and all the best games. And I think that's what's really true about Canadian football, that we tend to, compare it to the National Football League, where the scale of economics is just so drastically different. Do their broadcasts look more polished than CFL broadcasts do? Yes, they do. But they have more money to spend on. And I think sometimes there are advantages to being able to have a 32-team league where you can bury your lousy games on regional TV and no one sees them. On TSN, where we only have 4 or 5 games a week, we have games that are every game's national. So if we have a game between 2 lousy teams, that's going across the country. So there are some inherent limitations in a smaller league in a smaller country. But if you look at the Canadian Football League alone, people ask me all the time, hey, really, Dave, what kind of football do you like best? Do you like NFL or CFL? I'll say, you know what I like? I like good matchups. I'll watch New England play Pittsburgh before I'll watch, the BC Lions, playing it was lousy Toronto, for instance. But I'll watch, Calgary play Saskatchewan before I'll watch, Tampa Bay play Cleveland. It's all to me in good matchups. But, I understand it, but I think sometimes conclusions are drawn off the impression a league can create that don't necessarily, line up with the realities that people would draw from those impressions.
And the point that you make there about a lousy NFL game versus a great CFL game, and yet a lot of people and people that I've spoken with would still appreciate more of an NFL game. I'm not trying to watch the Browns play the Bengals. I would rather watch a CFL game versus that. And again, like you said, a lot of it is based on opinion. And I've spoken to people that have said the exact same thing that you're saying is about exposure and promotion of the game. And of course, that takes funding, that costs money to do so. And Dave, I'm involved quite a bit in the sports betting industry, sports gambling industry. And the reason why I bring that up is, first of all, nationally in Canada and of course in all of North America, that industry is extremely growing. But the reason why I bring it up is because a lot of people that I know and work with throughout the industry have definitely gotten more into the Canadian Football League based off the exposure they've gotten with finally being able to watch more games with ESPN. And I think that they've done a great job of promoting it a lot more and the exposure. And I love what you're saying there about, just because a player in the NFL is great and making these great catches, it does not mean that a player in the CFL isn't making highlight plays as well. It might not be at that caliber. And the whole soccer example is a perfect example because there's so much talent all over the world. And I think we can look at even in the NHL, we've got guys in the AHL creating highlight plays every single night. So I completely agree with that. And I think that it'll only grow more and more. And I think as the years progress and as, people start to fall in love with these players a lot more, and Americans are watching some of these players play in college and now go towards the CFL, they'll stay in touch with them and hopefully be able to see more action on ESPN networks and those type of networks to be able to stay in touch with them. Look, Dave, I don't want to sit here and ask you to explain some of the difference in rules. Yeah. I can do that on a different podcast. We can tweet it out, different things like that. But what I was hoping you would do just briefly for me is, for some people that don't know much about the CFL, just kind of describe the game to them, because I would describe it as a different type of football. It's still football, but it's definitely a different type of game.
Yeah, no question. And I think if you look at the history of people that have come to this league, either as players or coaches, if you disregard that, it's really hard to have success. It really is a different game. The skills are the same. Blocking, pass rushing, running with the football, breaking tackles, catching the football. They're all the same skills, but the way the strategies are quite different, and the types of players you employ in certain roles. And makes people sometimes be surprised, but there are players that are in the National Football League that couldn't play in the CFL. That 330-pound run-stuffing nose tackle, who's worth a zillion in the National Football League, doesn't have a place on a CFL field. He can't go sideline to sideline, and there's not enough rushing in the sport to employ a guy to just plug holes in the middle of your defensive line. So, it requires a more athletic player. You're on a bigger field. You just by sheer math, when you've got 3 downs to go 10 yards on a 110-yard field, as opposed to 4 downs to go 10 yards on a 100-yard field, you're biting off. You're trying to bite off bigger chunks of yards, every time. So you're seeing fewer, 2 and 3 yard plays and more 10 and 15-yard plays just by the nature of that. So, it's a league that encourages a little more risk, and that's part of the sport. It's also a league that values the return game, both, in punting and on kickoffs, more than the National Football League does. So there, on the surface, it doesn't look like a very different game, but once you get, beyond that and actually work into, the roles the players take, the types of players you're looking for, there are a lot of differences between the two sports. And again, I value both games. I like Canadian football better, but there are elements in the NFL that I appreciate. I love the fact that in the NFL you can put together a 14-play drive. That's awfully hard to do in the CFL. But I also, hate the fact that in the NFL you can put together that drive with 6 minutes left in the game, and if you manage the clock, you can end the game on one knee. There's definitely rules that make the Canadian Football League a more entertaining game.
A lot of times when I'm talking CFL on my podcast and breaking down the games and looking over the matchups and things like that, a lot of times people that are hosting these podcasts with me, they're asking me about these college players they used to watch and players that they admired and were huge fans of. And recently, over the past few years, I've gotten a lot more into college football, Dave, but I'll be honest, college football is not something I've always followed, but I find it very interesting because it's cool for me to track the journey that they take from college football to trying to make it to the NFL to seeing where that next journey takes them. And of course, we just recently had the CFL draft, and we'll get into that in just a few minutes. But what would you say is really the journey for people? The difference that you see someone from college football. They don't really make the NFL. They try that route and then end up trying it with the CFL. And I know this is kind of a catchy name to say, but to throw out there, a guy like Johnny Manziel, Johnny Football, I mean, he had quite the journey through all of it, ended up playing in the CFL. There was obviously some things that didn't work out, and there's been a bunch of players where it has worked out for them. How would you describe the journey for especially American players making that journey, from playing college, now making their way over to the CFL?
Well, it's funny because, as I was a kid, I watched a lot of American college football, and that was actually a big, appeal to me as a CFL fan, was that I could watch a guy play in the Rose Bowl one year and then watch him play in the CFL. Like, I remember watching J.C. Watts play at Oklahoma, and then I remember watching Perry Tuttle play at Clemson, and so when J.C. Watts was quarterback of the Ottawa Rough Riders and Perry Tuttle was starring for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, I remember those guys. And we were talking about perception. I mean, you take the average sports fan, especially in certain parts of the country, and they will believe that college football teams are better than CFL teams. And again, because they see them playing in front of 90,000 people on huge fields, on huge stage, and it just looks bigger and it looks grander. And again, they've got the money for some of the production values that to really enhance the product. The fact is, I can sit here. I mean, look, the SEC is the best conference in college football, right? I could name you off the top of my head a whole slew of SEC quarterbacks that won the national championship in American college football, but couldn't play in the CFL a lick. I mean, Chris Leak, T. Martin, Jay Barker. I mean, those guys are from Alabama, Florida, and Tennessee. They all won national championships. They all came to the Canadian Football League and couldn't play at all. So that's, again, the perception thing that, well, if a guy is a starting quarterback on an SEC national championship team, of course he's going to play in the CFL. Well, maybe not. I mean, Joe Burrow was the starting quarterback of an SEC team that won a national championship, and he's the number one pick in the NFL draft. But there's lots of guys that have had success at that level that can't play here. And again, look at CFL training camp cuts every year. They're cutting guys from LSU and Alabama and Notre Dame and all the best schools. It's just part of there are more doors. There are more players that want to go through the door to get into the CFL than there are spots available. I always use this stat to try to again enlighten people. Okay, the National Football League cuts roughly 1,200 players on Labor Day weekend every year. Okay, they reduced their rosters from 9 to 53. I think they're now going to be 56 or so, 90 to 53. They're going to be 56 or so now, but roughly 1,200 players who are good enough to put their names on an NFL contract, not just good college players, guys who have NFL contracts, get cut every Labor Day weekend. A small percentage of those players will be offered jobs in the Canadian Football League. Like that kind of, when you put it that way, sometimes people start to get it about the quality of players in this league. But, to your point about American college football, I actually think, and I've said this for a long time, that the pedigree and the backgrounds of the players who play in the CFL are kind of an untapped resource. I mean, I know we do it a little bit and we talk about it, but we haven't really gotten through to the general sports fan. A lot of times, general sports fan thinks guys who play in the CFL played in Division 2 or 3, somewhere in Iowa. Well, some of them did, but most of them played at big-time schools, at big-time places, right alongside guys that went on to the National Football League. And the difference between them and the guys who went on to the National Football League is very marginal, sometimes undetectable to, the average sports fan. So, again, I think it's one of the things that we get into, perception and reality. But, for most players who come out of American college football, they don't think about the Canadian Football League. They're completely focused and wired on the NFL. And then their dream comes to an end. Right? When they aren't drafted, they aren't signed, or they go to camp and they get cut. And then there's this kind of their agent will say to them, well, you want to play in Canada. And that's why I think we you experience such a high level of gratitude among CFL players, not just Canadians, but the Americans, because they're all guys who had their dreams end. And then all of a sudden someone said, well, maybe your dream doesn't have to end completely. And some guys will come up here, most of them will come up here thinking they're playing one season in the CFL and then they're going back to the NFL. That is the absolutely ubiquitous attitude of American players who come here. And I understand why. But they usually quickly learn that that's not necessarily going to happen to all of them. The truth is it happens to a very small percentage of them. Some guys stay here and have great careers and, get married and raise their families here. And, and look back and say, man, I remember the first time I ever came to Canada. I thought I was just coming for a year or two to play football and then going home. And this is where I made my life. So it can be a journey that not only changes their football careers, it can be a journey that changes their lives. I mean, even in a city like Toronto, which is not exactly, CFL Central, I'm not sure there's a more recognizable face than Pinball Clemens, who grew up in a poor area of Florida, and yet because of football, he's as recognizable and frankly as socially influential as almost anybody in this city.
And we've talked a lot about Americans making their journey into the CFL, and I want to just touch on really quickly before we get into the state of the current league and the league itself. I grew up in the Maritimes. I'm from Halifax, Nova Scotia. I've watched St. Mary's Huskies football, St. Francis Xavier X-Men football, Acadia Axemen football. And I kind of want to just get your thoughts real quick because we talked a lot about the journey to making the CFL, but just from the Canadian side, these Canadians, we just recently had the draft, and I know there's a certain amount of Canadians that have to be on each team as well, on each active roster. How is it for Canadians, playing 1 minute on the St. Mary's Huskies and the next minute they're on a BC Lions roster? What's the journey like for those guys?
It's a big step up. I mean, and I'm not trying to disparage, Canadian university football, but look at the high ends. There's a reason that most CFL players come from about a half dozen programs, right? Because there's about 6 or 8 programs in this country that play at a significantly higher level than most of the rest, and they tend to churn out CFL players. I can name the schools, right? Like Western, McMaster, University of Calgary, Laval, Montreal, University. I don't know if I mentioned University of Saskatchewan, UBC. I mean, there's a handful of them that play at a significantly higher level. But even so, that's a big step up. And the guys who are coming from the elite levels of Division I, NCAA, whether they're Canadian or American, have a much smaller gap just because of the quality of the athletes that are on the field. But that's why even something like the CFL draft, so many teams are not drafting the best player in the draft today. They're drafting the guy who they think will be the best player 18 to 24 months from now, because they understand there's going to be a process of getting more physically mature through weights and diet. There's going to be technique and just rising to the level of competition. So it is a big step, far bigger step than it is for, coming from the NCAA. But we have seen guys that have been able to shoot the curve on that. But for the most part, it's getting an opportunity from a Canadian school to go play in the CFL is more like a development opportunity for most players than it is, arriving and having impact right away at that level.
Once again, TSN football insider Dave Naylor joining me. And Dave, I'd just like to say I hope you and your loved ones are doing great during this time of COVID-19. It's definitely been a hard time for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. So I just wanted to pass that along to you. And I wanted to ask you, really just before all of this started and before we had to deal with COVID-19 and different sports organizations are dealing with solutions for COVID-19 and the funding, so on and so forth, how was the CFL doing and what is the state of the league before this happened and now with all of this going on?
Well, I think it's night and day. I mean, I attended the league meetings back in January, and everybody's very bullish on the direction of the league. They had the ownership issue in Montreal, which got solved over the off season. They are trying to venture out in their international vision for the league and all kinds of things, and is very, very positive. But as positive as it was, I mean, this is a league where the gate is the primary revenue stream. It's not like the National Football League where the gate supplements television money. In this league, television money supplements the gate. And if you can't put fans in the stands, if you can't put, an average of whatever it is, 23,000 fans a game at a CFL game, that's going to be really challenging to the business model. So, there's no revenue coming in right now. They're not selling tickets or sponsorships or partnerships or suites or any of that right now. And it's very uncertain about what the conditions would be like when and if they are able to play. So, yeah, it's a very, frankly, frightening time for the Canadian Football League.
It's definitely $1 million question, Dave, but would you be able to give us an estimate of when you think we'll be able to see CFL football next? And if we do, how many games will be in that season for each team?
I would say not before September. And,
I would not be surprised at all if the Canadian Football League doesn't play this year. And I'm not sure it'll be their decision. I think it may be just simply like right now, you can't have a football practice legally in Canada. You can't put 100 players and coaches on the field. That's the first thing have to be able to do before you even get into issues about players crossing the border, about testing, about what you do in the event of an outbreak, about can you have fans in stands, and if so, how many? I mean, there are a ton of issues to work through. And again, I suspect that this decision may ultimately not be left in the hands of the Canadian Football League. It may be made by government regulations that just make this too difficult. So it's not anything the league created. It's not anything the league can do anything about. They can just prepare to be ready to play in the event that things improve. But even if they improve in Canada, as they are in several areas of this country, especially once you get out of the middle of the country. But look what's going on in the U.S. And that's where, most of the coaches and half of the players come from. And so that complicates the issue, that much more.
And it's already an issue for teams and players. But of course, like you mentioned, the possibility of the season being completely canceled could cause assortment of all kinds of more issues and concerns. So I did want to touch on the national headline of the funding the CFL has requested from the government. Can you just weigh in on that, your thoughts on it, and what you've heard about that?
Well, I think the thing is that the league's taking some criticism for not being more transparent or having such a huge number and all those kinds of things. That a couple of things that I would just say in their defense, like the headline, said $150 million what they're looking for. Okay, it's really hard to say what is going to be the cost to their business because, like everybody else, they're dealing with so much uncertainty. And people say to me, well, why couldn't they be more specific about what they're spending the money on? Well, you tell me what the world's going to look like in September. I think it's just very difficult. I think they have so many scenarios, which is why you see such a wide range of how much money they might need. The other thing is, I think you want to ask based on a worst case scenario. What a great story if you can ask for $150 million and at the end of it, the Canadian Football League says, there's $30 million we didn't really need. So here you go. As opposed to asking for $100 million and then saying, what, this is much more treacherous economically than we thought. And we're going to go back to the government and ask for more because how that's probably going to go. The other thing I think people should realize is that, about a third of that ask was really to try to help the league get through next offseason towards 2021 in what is expected to be a very harsh business environment and really, make sure the league is on solid footing and can address what costs and rules may be in place that restrict its flow of business by next season. So it wasn't even necessarily a this season ask. It was kind of a this season and next season ask. And as I say, I can't say, I certainly understand people when you see that much money asked for, people are going to say, well, what do you need it for? But I think those are very difficult questions for the league to answer right now because they're as blind to what lies ahead here as anyone is.
And would you say that a significant number, as a lot of people are calling it, was more so just that's the most that they'll need? That was more so, like you said, insurance purposes and just kind of thinking for the longer term. And I think that's the problem a lot of people are thinking of, that it's short-term money. But like you said, that $150 million, that's for long term, correct?
Yeah, that's to see the league, into next season, is what I believe it is. And again, I think it's just there's so much uncertainty about the state of people's ability to buy tickets, even if they are able to sit in the stadium safely, about sponsors, about all these kinds of things. So it's not like I guess the easiest way to understand it is, it's not like if you've got government assistance and you were able to get through and play the Grey Cup, with or without fans or limited fans, that you get to the end of November and say, okay, now we're in a normal environment. We can sort of turn the page and start looking towards 2021. No, it's not going to be a normal environment for a long time.
And Dave, once again, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I'd be disappointed in myself if I didn't ask you this question, so I have to jump into it. Again, sure. I'm from the Maritimes. I'm really hoping to see a CFL team. We do not have really a professional team here in the Maritimes. We have, some soccer, things like that, lacrosse now, but I'd love to see a CFL football team, a CFL stadium. And I'll be quite honest, even, being close to everything, it's been hard to find information on it. Is there anything you can give me to give me some hope and maybe give me a timeline to when I can hopefully go out on the weekend with some friends and watch some CFL football in my backyard?
Well, I mean, I think up until March, when the pandemic really closed everything, I'm led to believe that the conversations between the Maritime Football Limited and the provincial government were going well. They'd already got the commitment of $20 million from the city of Halifax, contingent on them finding a different location. I think I've had some contact with that group recently. They are still very bullish on it. They understand, again, that everything has changed, priorities have changed, uncertainty rules. But I think they also understand that one of the things that governments may need when this is over is kind of, projects that are ready to go to help put people back to work and stimulate the economy. And I'm not an economist, so that's kind of beyond my pay grade, but I know that's kind of where their thinking is going. In terms of timelines, again, timelines are very, very difficult for this kind of thing. I know when the audit group, were going through their process, they eventually just accepted that it would take as long as it would take. The pandemic, again, throws so much uncertainty in it. Is this a 1 year thing? Is this a couple of year thing? How does that shift priorities? What kind of money does the government have? I can really kind of speak to this up until March, and after that, it's like everything else. It's had a blanket of uncertainty thrown over it. But I know the group hasn't gone away. The league hasn't, certainly turned its back on its initiative to go there, and they're still very hopeful that as the league is able to see its way through this circumstance, that a Halifax franchise is still waiting on the other side somewhere not too far down the road.
Dave Naylor, TSN's Football Insider, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak with me and talk some CFL. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.